Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will be able to access it again later. We will be sending out an email after today's webinar that includes a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll take a few minutes near the end of today's presentation and go through those questions. And finally, at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. So stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of the 3 lucky winners drawn today. Okay, with that, we'll kick off today's webinar, which is use the same certificate process across your DevOps toolchain. Our speakers today are Sandra Crust, who is Senior Product Marketing Manager at Venafi, and Helen Beal, who is DevOpsologist at Ranger 4. And Helen, I gotta tell you, you win the prize for the coolest title ever.
I made it of myself.
I love it, I love it. Well, Sandra, I believe you are going to be starting the conversation, so I'm gonna just put myself on mute and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that. Good morning and afternoon. My name is Sandra Crust, and thank you for that great introduction, Charlene. I am a Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Venafi and lead go-to-market activities for Venafi's Cloud and DevOps Solutions. I'm really excited to be joined here by Helen Beal with this amazing title, DevOpsologist. And I wanted to give Helen the floor just to give a quick introduction about herself. She's involved in many, many things. So Helen, if you would just give a quick introduction so people understand where you're coming from.
Thanks, Sandra, and hello, everyone. So I made up the job title DevOpsologist as a kind of description of what I do. Anything with an ology like biology or technology is the study of something. So I use it to describe that I study DevOps on a day-to-day basis, and I do that through a kind of range of consulting and coaching activities. I do quite a lot of work assessing organizations' capability or fluency around DevOps and conducting workshops and value stream mapping, and I do a lot of training. So I'm an instructor at Range 4 for the DevOps Institute range of courses. And I also write content as product owner for the DevOps Institute, and I do quite a lot of DevOps writing for both the DevOps Institute and also for InfoQ, where I'm a DevOps editor, and you'll see me pop up as a guest writer on the Venafi blog, and I just published something on Medium on the IT Revolution blog, so I'm starting to feel a little prolific, but yeah, that's me.
Awesome, Helen. I don't know how you sleep at night. You have so much going on. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today. During today's webinar, we're going to be discussing a really important topic, which is machine identities in DevOps environments. We're going to explore current practices, associated challenges, and new ways to approach the problem of getting trusted policy compliance certificates into highly dynamic DevOps environments to secure machine-to-machine communication, save developers and operations teams tons of time, and improve the security posture of your organization while giving security teams the visibility and control they require. Our agenda today, we're going to talk about DevOps and DevSecOps, and then we'll explore why using trusted certificates are essential and dive into where certificates play a role in the DevOps toolchain. Lastly, we'll discuss the new guidance from NIST and how security teams can offer certificate service so that developers and operations teams can have a consistent process that abstracts away details to save them time so they can focus on what really matters, which is developing new technology innovations to stay competitive in the market. But before we dive into that, I'd like to share a little bit about why protecting certificates in the DevOps environment is critical in the age of digital transformation. So on every network, there are 2 actors, people and machines. People rely on usernames and passwords to identify themselves and to gain access to machines and applications and devices. but machines don't. They use digital keys and certificates to authenticate and secure those communications between the machines. With the advent of digital transformation, the perimeter is effectively gone, and applications should be considered zero trust environments. You can no longer just rely on those web application firewalls. Certificates are now also needed to authenticate and encrypt all machine-to-machine communications, whether those machines are containers or microservices or servers or virtual machines. As a result, the number of machines is going through the roof, but security teams can't keep up. And application development teams are running rogue, but at what cost? So in any complete identity and access management program, it's really important to secure and protect the identities of both people and machines. But in most organizations, that's not what's happening. Also, attackers are getting smarter and will use SSL to hide and encrypted traffic and execute their attacks. According to Gartner, Gartner predicts that 70% of network attacks will use SSL by 2020. And Forrester predicts that a security or compliance breach will shock DevOps advocates, forcing greater focus on governance and toolchain oversight. So given this new attack surface, let's talk about how DevOps is disrupting IT and why DevSecOps is really important. Helen, as an expert in DevOps, can you speak a little bit about DevOps and how it's revolutionizing our IT landscape?
Yes, I think it's worth probably kind of going back to the start a little bit with DevOps and talking about where it came from. And it really came from this idea about agile system administration and this observation that the development teams were becoming under increasing pressure because of the digital disruption in the landscape to develop more and develop faster. And that's all very well, but there was a cadence problem in that the development teams were trying to do things in an agile way and the IT operations people were not. So there's what we call this portmanteau, so this squishing together of two words. So my other two favourite portmanteaus are brunch and brangelina. So this kind of squishing together of words was showing us that we needed to align these two groups of people and break the silos down between them. And that pain, when sort of 10 years ago or so when DevOps really started, a lot of the pain then manifested itself around things like developers throwing code over the wall and the operations people deploying it and then it going wrong, and then lots of fingers being pointed at each other and lots of confusion about what was going on, and lots of complaints about environments taking 6 weeks to be provisioned and things like that. And the landscape's moved on a little bit in the DevOps world since then. And we'll come back to that kind of in a few minutes when we talk specifically about DevSecOps. But, you know, DevOps has always kind of resisted this definition. There's no manifesto online in the same way that there is in Agile. There's no publications in the way that there is with ITIL. It's been allowed to develop and evolve as time has gone on. But really what we're trying to do, my favourite definition, if I'm really forced into a corner to try and explain what DevOps is in as few words as possible, I'll say it's about delivering value outcomes faster, safer, and more reliably.
Great. Thank you so much for that information, Helen, around DevOps. So I think we can all agree that we live in a digital world where technology is disrupting and creating many industries. Personally, I never thought it would be a great idea to jump into a stranger's car or stay at someone's house, right? Rather than take a taxi or stay in a hotel. So my mind is blown as old paradigms are challenged by new technology innovations. And I'm just expecting that the world is going to be a whole different new place in 10 years. But so this digital transformation is driven by the adoption of three things. The first one is cloud migration and the use of infrastructure as a service, PaaS, serverless, containers, and SaaS. And according to Forrester, 74% of enterprises say that their strategy is a hybrid or multi-cloud strategy, which in itself introduces a new level of complexity. Digital transformation is also driven by architectural modernization, where we're moving from monolithic applications to serverless and stateless services. where developers are coding applications to be API-centric using modern languages. And then, of course, the third thing is DevOps, where there's high-performance IT, where things are automated, and the focus is on fully integrating all the pieces and parts of the software lifecycle to deliver innovations, to delight customers, and to also remain competitive in the market. So with this change, when it comes to TLS certificates, this transforms the way certificates need to be managed from a push model to a pull model. So with new ephemeral infrastructure being spun up and down, certificates must become part of the configuration process and be ready at minute one of that infrastructure's life. And machine identities actually live at the cross-section of these three things. With digital transformation, machine identity proliferation is happening at an alarming rate, but developers are creating their own solutions and workarounds, mostly because many times their security teams just don't have a good solution in place for them. And according to our CIO study, we found that 79% of CIOs expect the speed of DevOps to make it really difficult to know what is trusted and what is not. And the key point here is, in a zero trust environment, it's important to secure the cloud workloads and communications between modern architecture. But it's ultimately critical to do so with trusted certificates that are known and controlled by the security organization. In order for organizations to know what to trust, they have to embed those trusted machine identities into the DevOps workflows. And this is super challenging for most organizations. So, Helen, I know the term DevSecOps is pretty hot right now. Can you share some of your insights on why this term exists?
Sure. So we talked about digital disruption and transformation, and I alluded to the fact that over the last decade or so that DevOps has been around. It's evolved, and there have been several drivers for that evolution. You just highlighted some of the key ones there, particularly cloud adoption and the speed at which that has happened within the last decade. And, you know, there are some things like, you know, I talked about this pain around it taking 6 weeks to provision an environment. That was one of the big pains that people talked about, that really was kind of the manifestation of the conflict between Dev and Ops a few years ago. And a lot of that's gone away these days, excuse me, because of cloud adoption primarily. So we kind of, the model, if you like, the DevOps model continues to evolve in terms of the patterns that we're seeing and the problems that we're trying to address. And when DevOps sort of started, security was not really a big part of the conversation. It was a little bit of an afterthought, if we're kind of fair to it. And I think that's partly because security is quite a separate part of an organization in most companies we work with. For example, one of the first questions I'll ask is, you know, do you have a security department and an infosec department? Where do they report into? Quite often we'll just have a security department that reports into the CEO, so not really that closely connected to the main technology teams. We also see patterns of very small ratios of people. So, you know, some people will talk about the ratio of 100 developers to 10 IT ops people to 1 security person. So there's a real kind of constraint around this area. And the other kind of part of the landscape that's changing, as well as the machine proliferation that's happening because of the cloud and microservices and containers, we're also seeing the threat landscape changing. So there's much more security threats now than there ever have been before. So it's kind of a bit of a perfect storm that people are trying to deal with. So taking into account all of that, the DevSecOps word came about, and a couple of years ago I was presenting at AppSec EU conference in Belfast, and I was presenting about DevSecOps engineering on the DevSecOps track, and I was chatting to one of my fellow speakers on the track, and they said to me, I really don't like this term DevSecOps. And I thought, well, that's a little strange because you are on the DevSecOps track. But I asked them what it was, and they said, well, you know, it's difficult enough for people to understand what DevOps is and find a definition for that without having yet another kind of word or subword here as well. And I kind of thought, you know, that's a fair point. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I always use this little bit of analogy. I'm never sure how appropriate it is, but this analogy that I think it's a bit like feminism, and until security gets the proper billing in the conversations that we're having around DevOps, it needs a little bit of extra support. So DevSecOps is really kind of saying, let's make sure that we are including the security people in the conversation. We are including security in our conversations around the DevOps toolchain. So I often like to refer to DevOps Handbook at this point, because it kind of reflects, again, it's like, you know, security is the kind of last word in the subtitle. It's in part 4, which is the last part of the book. It's actually the last 2 chapters of the book look at security. So it always seems to kind of come last. And it's kind of interesting when you think about the authors of the DevOps Handbook. Obviously, one of them, Gene Kim, that also wrote the Phoenix Project. And I always think about the character John, who is the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer in the Phoenix Project. And he actually plays such a pivotal role, and is such a great characterization of what we see as we see people go through DevOps evolution, in that they start with a security team that are quite computer says no, if you like. They're seen as, you know, big blockers to trying to get anything done. But John in the Phoenix Project has this kind of epiphany, and he comes back and works with Bill, the main protagonist of this book, and they go around to the business and properly start gathering vision and requirements and needs, and understanding what's really going on. So that's really kind of the core of DevSecOps, is the realization that it's been a bit of an afterthought. It's pretty much always the last thing that people build into their DevOps tool chains, and there is always a constraint around the number of humans in an organization that understand the security challenges, and most importantly, the security fixes. So what we're really trying to focus on is breaking that constraint.
So Helen, thank you for that information. And so I think now what we're going to really talk about is why trusted certificates are essential. And when we say trusted, it's really a loaded word, right? Trusted means it's policy compliant, there's visibility, and there's it's a known artifact, right, within the network. And there recently were some areas where machine identities, in this case certificates, didn't work as intended. And Helen, I think you have some information that you'd like to share about that around some machine identities going bad. So I was just thinking that would be an interesting thing to talk about, to understand the risks of basically using certificates in a way that is sort of rogue and maybe untracked, and what are the outcomes, what are the bad outcomes that can happen as a result of that?
Yeah, and you kind of think of them, I mean, we know they're important, right? But they're kind of little annoying things, lots of them that we have to manage. But the impact, as you say, or the kind of negative outcome of getting this wrong could be really quite significant. So the first little story I wanted to talk about was Ericsson, which is a European mobile phone network provider. In the UK, it's actually O2. And I'm an O2 user, and late last year, there were tens of millions of us that just couldn't use our mobile phones. And I kind of laugh a little bit, because there is this kind of this modern malaise where we're all like almost surgically attached to our phones. But you know, they do so much for us, and you know, sometimes it could have been an emergency that somebody needed to deal with, or they were trying to do some business and they couldn't use that phone today. And it's, you know, it's hugely inconvenient for lots and lots of people, and it's really kind of severe reputational damage. And that whole outage was caused by a single expired certificate in some of the software that they were using to manage the network. So, you know, that was a bad day for me and a lot of other people. The second little story I wanted to talk about was that, again, from the UK, one of our, in fact, the party in power currently, our Conservative Party, and this is classic, this one. In fact, the LinkedIn story on here is the same. It's just an expired certificate. In the Conservatives case, it's a horrible warning. You've probably seen it. I actually saw it yesterday on a system thinking website that I was working with, where they had this, and you get this warning that the certificate's expired, so your connection's not secure, and most browsers will not be at all happy about you connecting to it. And the LinkedIn story actually was another expired certificate, this time not the security warning, but again, not being able to actually connect in that way. And they did the same thing. I think, Sandra, they did that last week as well. They had another outage for the same problem.
Yep.
And then also Pokemon Go. So again, it's kind of like laugh a little bit, like it's kind of, you know, it's not kind of critical to our lives and stuff, but you know, a lot of people were using it, and there was a huge kind of stampede that the development organization needed to cope with, and a lot of that stampede was caused by a certificate that was incorrectly pinned that allowed some hackers to do access the API and do a man-in-the-middle attack and effectively kind of guide lots of people to where the Pokemons were. So, you know, there's some things you wouldn't really kind of naturally imagine happen when we get this certification wrong or incorrect. So really back to you, Sandra, to kind of reiterate about, you know, how these needs are growing.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so these are just a few examples. I mean, there have been many, many more outages and things like that. I mean, one of the recent things that came about was with obviously the Equifax issue, and that, you know, largely was related to an expired certificate, and that's gone up to the highest levels in the government. So the challenges can be extremely challenging for organizations, and sometimes people lose their jobs over certificate outages. So with that, you know, let's talk about where certificate needs are growing, why they're growing, and where they're being used. And I spoke about that a little bit earlier, but I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, in this new environment, you really just cannot terminate your HTTPS with a load balancer. That is no longer something that I would consider an acceptable practice. And so as a result, those certificates are needed across the entire application stack, which means servers, everything in the cloud, containers, VMs, and everything in your service mesh as well needs to be encrypted. All that communication machine to machine needs to be encrypted. And then with DevOps, you know, these certificates now need to span the full software lifecycle, all the way from dev to prod. So in order for that to happen, they have to be embedded within DevOps workflows in an automated fashion. And traditional approaches to certificates obviously no longer work in this new world. And heterogeneity is really a killer problem when you think about this at the large enterprise level, with hundreds of developers, pockets of DevOps, using hundreds of different tools across applications and environments and across multiple clouds, as well as on-prem. The thing is, what's interesting is this is not just a security problem. It's actually the growing pains are being felt by security and also by the developers. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more to help you understand why. So let's take a look at what are some of the methods that are commonly used by developers and operations teams that are working in these highly dynamic DevOps environments when it comes to certificates. So depending on the organization and level of security oversight, what we've seen from our customers is that approaches can span, it's like a huge Chinese menu, right? And so developers might be using Open SSL to generate self-signed certificates in their local environment. Another thing they might be using is a super popular tool, HashiCorp Vault, which is taking off in the DevOps space. And they're using probably many instances of HashiCorp Vault to get subordinate CA certificates or self-signed certificates. And so with that, you know, there's basically a whole bunch of different vaults being set up with individual teams and applications and environments in order to get who knows what kind of certificate, right? So this is one of the areas that Vetify is interested in solving for, actually. And the other thing that's happening is if an organization has really strong mandates around certificates, they might actually still be requiring that these individuals submit tickets to get trusted certificates, especially if they're EV or OV certificates. The only way that they can do that might be to submit a ticket, which might take days or hours depending on how efficient the organization is. And many times we've actually interviewed quite a few people. We're hearing that developers are actually using whatever CA they can get their hands on as quickly as possible, which sometimes means creating their own or having a CA under their desk. So that's creating a proliferation of rogue certificates that are unbeknownst to security and may not comply with policy. In addition, as organizations move things to the cloud, the public cloud providers are trying to make it as easy as possible to get certificates. So therefore, organizations tend to be gravitating towards those solutions. However, they're not fully fledged solutions across everything in the cloud. Let's Encrypt obviously is picking up a massive amount of the market when it comes to free certificates, partially because it's free and also because it's very easy to get started with and automates those certificate renewals for publicly facing infrastructure. Then there's the option of creating homegrown scripts or workarounds, which are sometimes very elaborate solutions that need to be created and tested and maintained. And then developers are also leveraging their native toolchain tools. So for example, if they're using Ansible, they might be using Ansible Vault or Kubernetes Secrets or Pivotal Cloud Foundry Cred Hub. So what does all this have in common, really? This basically Chinese menu of options, really what it does is introduces a lot of time and effort on the native by DevOps teams, and then also introduces complexity to an already complex world. The other day, I was just running across, I was in Reddit and looking through some of the questions, and I found one that I thought was really interesting and had a lot of questions and answers piling up. So this was 7 hours into the post, and there were already 37 questions. I checked last week, and it had over 62, I think. And the question was, what keeps a DevOps site reliability manager up at night? And this answer struck me as overly true. The answer said, unscheduled downtime or overtime due to poor planning for easily predicted and correctable problems. And then this is a bit of humor. Note the above is almost always a result of inconsistency across dev, test, and prod, where every dev setup is a brittle magic snowflake. Test is the fantasy land where only the happy path exists, and prod is this mystery snowflake that has been running for years. But nobody knows how it's actually set up. So, these developers are already working in a very complex environment. Even if it's automated, there's still a lot of complexity. And so certificates are just one added layer on top of that. And these developers are not necessarily PKI experts. So it's taking them time to learn each new way of getting a certificate, making sure they get the right kind. And, so it's really taking tons of time away from work that they should be doing on their applications themselves. But that doesn't actually mean they're doing things correctly. If they were to do things correctly, the developer and operations team members, independent of security, would have to operate and develop security infrastructure that does all of this. And this is just the bare minimum, right? It would have to make sure that the certificates they're using in these environments are trusted and protected. It would have to support multiple certificate authorities to get that crypto agility and CA agility. It would have to provide logging for audits. So all that reporting would need to be built. Obviously, adequate protection of private keys. And, the verification around compliance is another key issue that right now there's none of that going on. And if a security policy changes, like for example, if an algorithm gets deprecated and a new algorithm is now what the policy requires at that organization, if you think about all of these different methods today, you would have to go in and individually make sure that those certificates conform to that new policy. And so basically what this means is you need to have a resilient system that you can at a quick, basically in a single place, have a control lever where you can change the certificate attributes and or the certificate source so that you're getting that resilience to, if there's a CA compromise or if there's an algorithm that's being deprecated. And let's not forget, security teams need visibility to do their job. So, net, basically, there's already a lot of time being spent by DevOps, but they're not necessarily doing all of this. So what are some of the challenges and the risks of the current way of approaching things? So this is just a very high level top challenges for DevOps and InfoSec. So I've already touched on this quite a bit, but for DevOps, it's really all about diverting resources away from building business applications, which ultimately slows down development. And because there's all this complexity, a lack of standardization, they're also running into challenges when they want to migrate applications across environments or cloud providers, because they're basically locked in. And then they have to update their code, their pipelines, the scripts to get certificates based on the new environment, tool, or location. And this is all error prone, which creates these snowflake environments that are hard to troubleshoot and maintain. Not forget, they might also be experiencing outages, right? If there's something that isn't being monitored correctly, or maybe potentially is not automated on a renewal basis. And then for InfoSec, there may be no visibility. Likely there's no visibility. And there's also policy non-compliance because they don't have control over the certificates being used. That means that the security teams cannot audit the certificates for compliance, and they certainly can't remediate any issues because they don't have any control over those certificates being issued by these DevOps, the automated environments. So as a result, there may be weak certificates being used and private keys may be floating around where they shouldn't be, which an attacker could obviously use and then pivot. And because InfoSec doesn't have access to the private keys, they can't even inspect traffic to detect abnormal patterns that may be a signal that there's an active SSL attack underway. So, these are just the highlights. So, I just pulled this quote from Neil and Ian at Gartner, where they talk about, how you shouldn't force information security's old processes to be adopted by developers. Instead, you have to plan to migrate continuous security assurance seamlessly into the developer's CI/CD toolchain and processes. So this makes a lot of sense. And they go on to say, never make developers leave their toolchain environment. So, the question is where do certificates play a role within that DevOps toolchain? So I was going to turn it over to Helen to speak to us a little bit more about the DevOps toolchain at a high level, and then where certificates fit within that toolchain.
Great, thank you. So yeah, the DevOps toolchain. So if we could just skip to the next slide. There aren't that many blueprints, if you like, or architectural diagrams for what a DevOps toolchain should or could look like. Sonatype did quite a good collection of DevSecOps reference architectures, and you'll find one of ours from Range 4 in there, and you'll see this thing on the right, which is, we call it the DevOps loop, and it's the way that we express the parts of DevOps toolchain. You can see it starts with ideation, so the requirement where that comes from is conceptualized and nurtured, refined, prioritized, and then goes into development. And we talk about integration a lot rather than development, because we observe that a lot of development that happens in the current world is actually quite sort of composite, if you like, so composing applications from artifacts that have been pre-built. And then we talk about testing, and of course, a lot of that testing integration happens very closely together. And then we talk about it going into production. Then the final step in our 5-step DevOps loop is realization. So the point at which we start realizing the value, and then that links directly back the feedback into our ideation cycle. Some of you on the call may have previously seen DevOps architectures like a figure of 8. I personally am not a big fan of those, because on one side we have dev, on the other side we have ops, and what we're really trying to do is not have that separation and really looking at things as a value stream, or as in this case, a continuous release cycle. So that's kind of how we think of the DevOps toolchain, and it differs a bit from where a lot of organizations kind of evolve their own toolchains. So what tends to happen in most of the organizations that we work with is that a development team will decide that they want to initially do something like automate some builds, and then they'll automate some tests, and they'll gradually build out a tool chain themselves from kind of no, if you like, initial architecture. And of course in DevOps we don't want lots of upfront planning, but if you don't have an upfront architecture, you really don't think about that whole loop, so that end-to-end life cycle. So you don't think about transparency through the value stream, you don't think about how you might deal with something like, for example, an issue that's raised in ServiceNow that actually needs to become a development ticket in Jira. You don't necessarily start out on the road thinking about that level of integration and visibility and transparency. So this quote from the DevOps Handbook, we use this ever such a lot. It's quite wordy, but there's basically two things, two sentiments that it's saying there. One is one way to really help is for IT operations to provide the DevOps toolchain as a shared service. And I am yet to meet a development team that if I ask them, would you like to manage your DevOps toolchain, they say yes. Most development teams or product or functional teams that are, or feature teams that are oriented around delivering product will not want to manage that tool chain. So it's a shared service, that self-service that IT operations can provide, or there are different models, of course. In the Spotify model, have things like infrastructure squads. So that's our kind of first recommendation, to think of the tool chain that way. And then the second part of what the DevOps Handbook says here is basically, we use this often as a really quick kind of gap analysis or checklist. So we literally get a flip chart, write the items down on a bulleted list, and then go through with the teams in the room about whether they can say that they have those things. So do you have a shared version control repository? Do you have pre-blessed security libraries? Now, you'll notice a couple of those are highlighted there, pre-blessed security libraries and security scanning tools, not just because they reference security, which is what we're talking about here, but actually also because those are the two areas where we most commonly don't get ticks on the board. So again, this is grist to my mill that security is late to the party. It's the kind of last thing, the last bastion of DevOps, if you like, that people are thinking about. So if we think about where security fits into the tool chain and where Venafi specifically, so this machine identity management can give us what we need. We could move to the next slide. We can think about the positions of it. So, traditionally certificate management, we kind of maybe think of it as an IT operations task that happens sort of on a day-to-day basis, and someone runs around and looks and sees and finds out what is expiring and manually updates things. But it can happen much earlier than that. So as you can see on this diagram, we've really brought it in at the CI/CD level. So when it is part of the automated build process, the IT delivery time is hugely reduced. So we can do this job this early. We can incorporate it into our continuous testing through the route to live. So past our many brittle snowflakes, we can keep doing this. We can make it part of our deployment packages, and we can make it part of the way that we orchestrate and manage our environments, regardless of whether they are VMware in our data center or Docker and Kubernetes in our GCP environment. We can do all of this. So hopefully that gives you more of a sense of where Venafi and security fits into the overall DevOps tool chain. And if I could pass back to Sandra, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the guidance around the management of certificates.
Great, thanks, Helen. Yeah, you're right. So I think we've established the status quo is pretty complex and error-prone, costing developers time and putting the security posture of an organization at risk. Until now, though, there hasn't been much specific or prescriptive guidance regarding how to set up certificate processes for modern IT and DevOps specifically. The good news is that there is some new guidance from NIST regarding how to manage certificates. So this new guidance is NIST 1800-16B, And it's still out in a draft format because it was out for public comment in the beginning of the year, but as we all know, the government did shut down, so the public comment was not able to be, completed. So this is still in draft form, but we expect it will be made official later this year. And so what I've done is I've pulled out a couple of points, and what this is really guidance around how to secure web applications. And I recall, I think it's over 100 pages now, but basically it's about TLS server certificate management. And it talks about certificate management at a broad level, and then it also discusses specific things relative to DevOps. So I highlighted a few things that I wanted to discuss today. And the first one is that NIST actually appreciates that the definition of a certificate owner is shifting with DevOps, right? Where certificates are now being created and maintained, sorry, not certificates, infrastructure is being created and maintained by programmatic means rather than humans. So, in the past, you would have Bob the mail server, and Joe is the guy who's in charge of the mail server, and he's the one managing that certificate, and he's therefore the certificate owner. But with automation and programmatic means for infrastructure, that's completely changing everything now. So in section 4.1 of this new guidance, it talks about how with this new certificate owner sort of position, it can result in certificates for mission critical applications not being tracked. And it says this can be particularly problematic if bugs in DevOps programs or scripts cause certificates to be improperly deployed or updated. And DevOps teams, that adopt newer frameworks and tools, it's important to continue to monitor certificates and applications deployed and maintained by older DevOps frameworks and tools. So just something to think about. And I really wanted to highlight this. I think I put the URL at the bottom. So if you are interested in getting the details on this, it's available as a PDF. It has 4 parts to it. Parts 3 and 4, I think, are still under development, but parts A and B are available. Part A is just an executive summary, which is about 2 pages long. And then part B is the more detailed guidance. And then importantly, what this is talking about is the best practice of establishing a certificate service. So in section 5.2, the guidance states that the most efficient and effective approach is for a certificate services team. And what they're referring to here is basically the PKI team or the security team. So they're saying that the certificate services team should provide a central certificate service that includes technology-based solutions that provide automation and that support certificate owners in effectively managing those certificates. So what does that really mean in simple terms? This means that security or PKI teams need to offer service to developers and operations teams so that they can programmatically access trusted certificates and help them manage those certificates over time. So with this new guidance, there's an actual official recommendation to set up and standardize a centralized certificate service. So I think it's relevant to our conversation today. But why is a certificate service valuable? The reason is because it leaves all of the details of making those decisions around certificate attributes and sources to the PKI experts while abstracting away the details from DevOps. So Venafi's capabilities enable security teams to provide access to certificates in a way that abstracts away complexity. And this ensures that security is built into the application without the need for developers to maintain those cryptographic functions. So that saves them a ton of time. So here's a little bit more information about Venafi specifically for those of you interested. Venafi actually has been in business for over a decade and is recognized as the market leader for machine identity protection, according to Gartner and Forrester. The Venafi platform is capable of managing multiple types of machine identities, including certificates, code signing certificates, enterprise mobility certificates, and SSH keys. So it's not just about TLS, but we look at the gamut. When it comes to TLS certificates, though, the platform provides a single pane of glass with a centralized place to house certificate inventory, to enable security teams and PKI teams to set and enforce policy. Also provides reporting for audits and compliance checks. It has automation workflows. We have a very strong ecosystem of technical integrations. And it enables us to connect to any certificate authority. So to be clear, Venafi does not serve as a CA, but what we do is we offer a value-added management layer between that CA so that you have those capabilities. So to accelerate DevOps, we provide a lot of different options that security teams can offer to DevOps to embed those policy compliance certificates into their workflows. This includes an SDK and a command line utility that abstracts away our API. We also have an Acme server. So if you or your teams love Let's Encrypt because of the automated renewals, you can leverage our Acme server to get policy enforced certificates from any CA and automatically renew those certificates using the Acme protocol. And given that many developers like to code against an API, we obviously have a well-documented REST API and Web SDK as well. So with that, we discussed how Gartner said you should never ask DevOps to leave their tool chain. So as a result, we were building out a large number of pre-built integrations with DevOps tools, such as Chef, Ansible, Kubernetes, via JetStack Cert Manager, which is really popular, HashiCorp Vault and Terraform and Console, Docker and OpenCode, OpenStack. And then we've also, because some of our stuff is open source, we've recently seen our customers build against our open source vCert utility and develop integrations with OpenShift, among others. So all of these options enable developers and operations teams that are building applications during automated DevOps workflows and on-prem and across clouds to deliver certificates to both traditional and modern architecture and across the environments within their CI/CD pipeline. So it's a pretty powerful solution. And then for organizations that are migrating to the cloud and lifting and shifting infrastructure, we also have these agentless drivers that can be used to automate certificate renewals. Importantly, is both on native and on non-native cloud infrastructure. So, today, AWS is really good at automating that for their native stuff, like CloudFormation or AWS Elastic Load Balancers, for example. But when it comes to F5, so for instance, if you're lifting an existing F5 from your on-prem data center and you're going to a hosted F5 in AWS, you can actually automate certificate renewals on that F5 in AWS so that you can be certain there are no outages. So, if you want to check out some of these integrations, I've included our GitHub page URL on the slide for quick reference. So in summary, what Venafi does is it helps you deliver on the promise of DevSecOps. And for DevOps teams, what we do is we provide a fast and repeatable way to get certificates so that they can easily migrate the applications, automate renewals, and be certain that they are using those strong certificates that are necessary. And then for InfoSec, the platform provides centralized control and visibility so that you can enforce policy and gain assurance that policy is being complied with. So the reason is that you can simply literally switch a lever in the Venafi platform and change the CA or change the certificate attributes without impacting the code the developers are using. So it's a really seamless system for developers. And security can easily remediate issues, therefore, in the case of a CA compromise or deprecated algorithm or breach. And then also, we provide, private key storage that's secure and integrate with a lot of different HSMs. So what we're doing is helping our customers not only improve security posture, but accelerate DevOps securely by removing a huge burden on the application development teams and providing a solution that helps to automate all of this through a centralized service. So with that, Helen, do you have any other closing thoughts that you want to add before we open it up to question and answer?
Sure. I mean, I think the summary really is that security is a massive constraint and also a massive risk for all organisations due to digital disruption and the advent of cloud and the increasing threat landscape. So it's important to sort of take a cultural view or a cultural stance, if you like, that security isn't just one person's job. It really is. Everybody needs to play a role in it in an organisation, and everyone needs to be cognizant of this constraint and how to fix it. And you know, there are things you can do with the people, and I'm not suggesting we throw more people at the problem. And in fact, some reports tell us that there are 2 million open security, IT security or cyber security roles in the world today. But what I have seen work well in some organisations that I work with is, for example, having security people sitting with the feature teams and rotating round, so that knowledge kind of rubs off. It's a bit like the 80-20 rules, sort of 20% of the problems come from 80%. Sorry, 80% problems come from 20% of the things, so it kind of rubs off in the teams. But the better way for often to break these constraints is actually through automation. So it's sort of like it's like a hockey stick. It's sort of infinite, the amount of things that we can do when we automate things properly. So yeah, that's really the closing thought for me, is around everybody playing a role and really embracing automation as the key to break the constraint. I think we do have some questions coming through, so I think over to Charlene.
Okay, all right, great. Yes, we do have some questions that have come in so far, but there's time. If you have questions for either of our panelists, please use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. If we don't get to your question during the question and answer period, please know that the folks at Benify will be getting a copy of all of the questions, and so I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Let's go ahead and dive right in though. So first question, I believe is for you, Helen. We're just getting started with DevOps. What recommendations do you have to ensure security is aligned with DevOps initiatives?
So in my role, we do help a lot of people start on their DevOps journeys. We have this kind of lift-off approach we talk about, and the first thing we always advise people to do is to focus on a specific value stream, and as part of that, perform some exercises from the lean canon of work around value stream mapping. And even with a DevSecOps angle on that, we wouldn't change that advice, because what we're doing when we're doing value stream mapping is looking at the end-to-end process, including what we call the fuzzy front end. So the fuzzy front end being that kind of idea while it's kind of bouncing around various different business approvals and project boards and this, that, and the other before it hits the Jira backlog, or if you're still in that space, the Word document. And in fact, I'm recalling very recently, within the last month or so, one of our German clients, we did a current value stream map, and they immediately pulled out that they had an 8-week delay on security in terms of just getting an answer. So it really raises that up. And then the important thing about a value stream mapping exercise and thinking about value stream is that everybody in the value stream is involved in that conversation. So we have security in that conversation, so we can have a conversation about, why they're so under pressure and under resourced, and what we can do to try and improve that area. So in summary, start with the value stream.
Excellent. Okay, next question, Sandra, this one is yours, it looks like. We are migrating to the cloud and have started using certificates from our cloud provider. What considerations should we be thinking about?
Oh, that's a really good question. From public research, we know that roughly 62% of public cloud of organizations are, sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. So basically, we know that most organizations are using multiple cloud providers, and so that's the first thing to understand, right? 74% of organizations are doing that, and so when we talk to some of our customers, the other thing to consider is that, when we think about moving to the cloud, we think about a single AWS account and moving things into that account. We have actually spoken with a customer that had 2,500 AWS accounts and 1,500 Azure accounts. So if you can think about that at the enterprise level, if you're starting to use certificates from that public cloud provider, that may mean that you're using 2,500 or 1,500 different accounts. And unfortunately, AWS and Azure doesn't provide a unified viewpoint of the certificates that are being issued and in use. So when it comes to looking at security and compliance and visibility, it's really quite a siloed viewpoint. The other thing to think about is policy. So certificate policy around for cloud specifically, what you have to do is you really have to guard yourself and set up policies to protect against, expiration caused outages, server impersonation, CA, and crypto agility, and then encrypted threats. So when it comes to visibility, I kind of spoke about that a little bit. So with the Venafi platform, for example, you can actually get visibility to all of the certificates that are across all of your public cloud provider accounts. So that's one thing that's super valuable. The other thing to think about is that developers are coding against a specific cloud provider. So if your organization decides that, hey, there's going to be a cost savings, or there's a security reason or some other reason that you want to change your cloud provider from one to the other, you're having, again, to recode and relearn a whole new system. Whereas if you have something that's cloud agnostic, then you're no longer having to take that and create, a bunch of unplanned work, basically, in order to migrate applications. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is regulatory compliance. Regulatory compliance requires that security teams have visibility and control and visibility over those certificates. And unfortunately, the public cloud providers are really good at creating solutions that help you move faster, but they don't necessarily provide you the visibility and security policy enforcement that you require to comply with things like, PCI DSS or FedRAMP. So, a lot of our customers are the largest banks and retailers and transportation companies and healthcare companies, as well as the federal government. And so for those types of organizations, it's extremely important to be compliant with regulatory frameworks.
All right, great. We are about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so I think we can probably squeeze in one more quick question here. Helen, what are the most common pitfalls you've seen when it comes to shifting security left?
So I think, it is really kind of a people element here. In an ideal world, all non-functional requirements would be in the product backlog. So we would, shift left all the way to kind of the ideation level. The challenge really is about getting the people to come together to have those conversations. So getting the people the right security skills in the team to make those sort of definitions. And then kind of really from a more technical perspective, I think a common pitfall is kind of the nature of the tooling. Again, DevSecOps is a relatively new thing in the marketplace, and it's kind of emerging, and our understanding is growing and developing all the time. But tools that do things like scan for vulnerabilities and then produce a report, they are not unuseful, but somebody still has to read that report, digest it, think on it, actively act upon the recommendations in it. But if we have tools that are actually embedded into the developers' IDEs, and remember what Sandra was saying, that Gartner was saying about not asking the developers to leave their native toolchain environment, if we have things like that can flag up to the developer that there is a problem with a vulnerability or a certain way that a apparently open source license is used, or a certificate, and they are encouraged to remediate it there and then in the simplest possible way, that makes life a lot easier. But I think my observation would be that not everybody is thinking that way, and there are still quite a lot of tools that are quite popular in the DevSecOps marketplace that don't shift left as far as the backlog or the IDE, and are still coming a little bit later.
All right, then we're about a minute to the top of the hour, so I want to close out the question and answer period now. As I said before, if we didn't get to your question, the folks at Benify will be getting a copy, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to follow up with you offline. Real quick, before we close things out, I do want to do the 3 winners for the Amazon gift cards, $50 Amazon gift cards. Our winners are Victor G, Jorge R, and Dorrance M. So we'll be getting in contact with you via email to get the gift cards over to you. And also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you'll be able to listen to it again on demand. We'll be sending you a link to that webinar on demand later on today. It's also going to be on the DevOps.com website, so you can always check it out there. Just look in the webinar section on the site under on demand, and it should be right there. Sandra and Helen, both of you, thank you so much for such a great presentation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Great. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.